everyone. Depending on where you are, it may be a good morning, good afternoon, or a good evening. And I warmly welcome all of you to this session where we hope to engage as deeply as possible to learn about the current global dynamics, but also historical dynamics and potential future prospects. I'm Gabriel Darong from Rhodes University, and I'm a representative of the World Council of Anthropological Associations, and I'm the convener of this session. With me in today's discussion will be colleagues from different universities, but also from different geographical locations, who are all experts in the issues we're trying to address today. And as you will have seen from the title of the topic, we're looking at anthropological perspectives on neo-imperialism, intervention, and knowledge production, focusing on key case studies, which will include Ukraine, Russia, Venezuela, United States, Palestine, and Israel, as well as Ethiopia. And on the panel today is Agafari Solomon from Jinka University in Ethiopia. He is the head of Department of Social Anthropology at the university. His research examines pastoral conflict, medical anthropology, and indigenous conflict resolution mechanisms. He focuses on community-based approaches to peace building and health in pastoral societies, combining both ethnographic fieldwork with applied policy engagement. On the panel also is Dafna Rachok. Please, Dafna, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name properly. Dafna is a medical and political anthropologist with interest in global health, refugee health, humanitarianism, and state bureaucracies. She currently is writing a book on patient activism among vulnerable communities before, during, as well as post, possibly, all-out war in Ukraine. She is a Ukrainian-born scholar and rooted in the local context. She's combined her experience, but also lived experience as well as volunteerism in the book. Another panelist for today is Michel Bouchard, who is also a member of the WCAA. He is the former president of Canadian Anthropological Association, and he is a member of a minority French-speaking community in Canada. He has explored in his research topics around language, identity, and nationhood in Canada, Estonia, Russia, and currently Ukraine. The fourth panelist is Yael Berda. Yael Berda is from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research examines bureaucracy, colonial legacies, authoritarianism, and regimes of citizenship and mobility, with particular attention to Israel-Palestine in comparative perspective. She previously worked as a human rights lawyer and remains engaged in public debate and civil society initiatives. Colleagues, as you will have seen, we do have an interesting panel with diverse experiences. And our aim today is to really look at the issue of neo-imperialism from the different positionalities of our speakers, whether it be from their research experience, from their lived experience, or from engagements that they will have had with different populations. So I open the floor for an open discussion, and we would love to hear how each of our panelists conceptualizes this idea of imperialism as well as neo-imperialism, and how that has played out within the context in which they either live or research. And I'm opening this discussion in full awareness of the current war and attacks in the Middle East, where there have been multiple bombardments, which has led to the killing of the leader of Iran, or the supreme leader of Iran, and also acknowledging the further attacks that have taken place in um, Qatar and other Middle Eastern countries. So we can begin from the first panelist I see on my screen is Michel. So Michel, from your experience of work both in Canada and currently looking at issues of war and identity and displacements in Ukraine, how will you understand or how do you understand this concept of imperialism as well as neo-imperialism and its its current impact on the global society?
Yes, well, thank you so much, and everybody for being here to, I guess, in this webinar. What I'll start with, in a sense, is perhaps citing my own prime minister. So, Prime Minister Carney of Canada mentioned, he said, it seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can, and the weak must suffer what they must. And Carney correctly highlighted that in the past, yes, in certain ways it was a fiction. It was a fiction believed by all, but there were certain rules that nonetheless we paid lip service to. So we kind of knew how to operate outside of them, around them, but at least we kept some kind of basis for international stability. So this, it, so it, so it, I guess at the present time, we are moving to what I would say would characterize almost as a Viking-based logic of international order. So, in other words, we have the chieftain Trump, who instead of attacking the monasteries or other villages along the coast, is now seeking to force other countries to pay tribute, whether in the form of tariffs or trade concessions or money to be donated to Trump or his family via crypto or other means. So, whereas we no longer would necessarily wait for Viking longboats to appear on the coast, we now every evening, every night wait with great trepidation to see what Trump Truth social post will be made and where the next attack will be on whether international organizations, treaties, or the like. And with the case of Ukraine, the rules-based international order has been turned on its head. So Russia's invasion and annexation of territories in Ukraine have undermined the very basic rule that kept us somewhat at peace, or at least not in open global warfare since World War II. The principle that states don't invade and annex other states. They may be at war with them, they may have, in a sense, occupy parts of it, but they don't openly say, no, we're now adding it to our state because we all remembered what had happened, I guess, with a certain chancellor in Germany. So in other words, we may undermine, we may attack, but at least we go through the motions of trying to appear as if we were following the rules that were set, I guess, with the United Nations and other global conventions. Now, rather than trying to keep at least the facade of wanting to maintain these rules, Trump and the United States seems openly seeking to reward Russia rather than standing by the Budapest memorandum that they signed, a memorandum that stated the United States would protect the territorial integrity of the Ukrainian state. So what we are now in a world where signed treaties are now so very passé that all we can do is saying, how can we pay tribute to make sure that we can keep, I guess, our goals? And we see that he has done everything to undermine Ukraine. He has stopped selling arms. There is even some evidence that he was actually providing secret information to the Russians to provide them to facilitate them in their goals. And what was sought was tribute, was loot. So Trump wanted to get some kind of rare earth mineral deals that would favor the United States in exchange for some kind of support. And if that couldn't be obtained, then there was a secret $17 trillion trade deal that was being negotiated with Russia. In exchange, the United States would push Ukraine to capitulate. So in other words, what we have expected in the past is no longer the case. So in a sense, each must do what it can to survive and not trust any other state, any other international association, but the weak must try to gather together to at least to try to maintain themselves. With Venezuela, with the Longships attack, took the Venezuelan president hostage, and oil was the loot to be sold and put in Qatar accounts to be managed by Trump. Such actions, such overt stealing of the theft of other countries to be put into the bank account under the control of another president in another state would have been seen as crazy even a few decades ago. But now seems to be the new Trump norm. Now we have Iran. So for those of us who are old enough to remember, under George W. Bush, the USA at least went through the fiction of making its case before the United Nations and building a coalition. It spent weeks trying to put forward the evidence that there was there were weapons of mass destruction. There were questions put forward. You had Colin Powell appearing before the United Nations, and the United States at least tried to make its case. It sought allies. It sought others to work with it to try to establish, to play by the rules of the United Nations. But now with Iran, there was none of that. There was no UN, there was no allies, it was merely the United States, acting largely on its own in collaboration with Israel to try to achieve, well, we're not too sure what it wants to achieve. It was something that was created, seems to have been done on a whim with there was no even the attempt to give an explanation as to what goal was actually being sought, which international laws were being upheld, how this was going to mean, what this was going to mean in, this larger context. So for what I see is that sadly, again, we are at least the fiction that at least kept some kind of stability is no longer there. So now the question is, how are we now in this period where states under some leaders, are there simply to profit the leaders, to make as much money as possible for certain almost quasi chieftain slash imperial slash emperor figures who are there not even for nationalism, not even for the idea that they're just want to uphold the greatness of their state, but rather to make as much money for for themselves and their family and their allies, to put the money back to make sure that they keep the power that they need to continue amassing even more tribute from from the weaker around them, whether within the state or outside the state. So I shall end with that.
Okay, thank you so much, Michel, for that introductory remark. And colleagues, just to be aware, we aim to allow each panel member to speak about their perspective as an introductory remark. And we then open up for immediate engagement with the audience, but also to then give the panel members room to also engage with each other. So we're hoping that this will be a very open discussion from as many perspectives as possible, where we are able to engage with each other's views, challenge each other's views, but in the process, we're trying to learn as much as possible about these different geopolitical zones and the historical as well as the current experiences of people within these communities. Okay, thank you so much, Michel. So on the next panelist, we would like to hear an introductory remark from will then be Dafna. Dafna, please also just pronounce your surname so that we can pronounce it correctly next time.
Thank you, Gabriel. It's Rachok, but honestly, people can pronounce it in any way they see fit. I don't really mind. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here and to be talking to you all about the topic of neo-imperialism. I'm very glad to be talking to you about it because the place that I come from and the place that I also study, that of Eastern Europe, is usually absent from similar conversation. I think that Eastern Europe, especially for the discipline of anthropology, it has been in many ways a theoretical periphery. Of course, scholars did engage with this region, but compared to the amount of scholarship that we have that has engaged, for instance, with Latin America or with the Middle East or with the Pacific, Eastern Europe has been in many ways a theoretical periphery. So has been quite often like glossed over, sometimes by virtue of being geographically close to Western Europe, to places like Germany or the Netherlands. Eastern Europe has been often discussed as the Western agent of imperialism, which is, I think, untrue and undeserved. And sometimes, on the other hand, Eastern Europe and smaller countries like Ukraine or Belarus or Moldova, they are being denied agency at all, and they are viewed as supplements to their big neighbors, for instance, like Russia. So all tendencies that are going on in Russia, they are extrapolated to Ukraine, to Belarus, to Moldova. And it is very rarely that the countries of Eastern Europe are being engaged on their own terms and discussed together through the lens of decolonial studies. And let's not forget that Eastern Europe from the very beginning was the Enlightenment project of invention by Western philosophers, right? That it was from the outset, it was created as the other to the rational and enlightened Western Europe. Let's not forget that prominent theoreticians whom we may often cite in our research, like Max Weber in the late 19th and early 20th century, they viewed Eastern Europe through the lens of colonialism and the need to spread civilization there. And these theoreticians also contributed to occasionally stirring up fears of Slavs flooding civilized and enlightened lands. And these theoreticians were also advocating to close the borders between advanced empires living by the principles of modernity and the backward tradition-bound Eastern European Slavs. And I'm talking about these legacies because they continue to inform how Eastern Europe in general and Ukraine in particular are viewed today, both by scholars and the general public alike. However, I think that kind of like zooming it down a little bit further, I think that Ukraine is an interesting case because it offers an unusually clear lens on neo-imperialism, because it shows us how contemporary imperial power can operate without formal annexation, without stable colonial administration, and yet still have an impact on territory, on economy, and on people's subjectivities. Because Russia's involvement in Ukraine before, many years before and even during the full-scale invasion, I think it highlights this phenomenon of imperial rule at a distance. For instance, we can look at energy dependence, trade blockades, debt, and infrastructural leverage, oligarchic networks, and other governance technologies. Looking at Ukraine as a case to study neo-imperialism, I think it can also help us expose the cultural and legal repertoire of various neo-imperial projects like passportization and citizenship as tools of incorporation, the protection of compatriots as a portable justificatory frame, and the weaponization of history, language policy, and religious jurisdiction. And at the same time, I think the case of Ukraine demonstrates neo-imperialism's everyday and biopolitical dimensions. For instance, we can look at the occupation governance, and we can look at the mechanisms like filtration camps, forced identification, schooling reforms, information control, and reconfiguration of welfare. And through processes like these, we can see how empire is made through bureaucratic routines that sort bodies and produce compliant populations. And then last but not least, I think the case of Ukraine, also as the case of Gaza, for instance, they bring back this idea of the politics of infrastructure, because we can look at the attacks on hospitals, energy grids, water systems, and this can help us conceptualize imperial domination as the capacity to modulate heat, light, mobility, and medical access, how essentially care itself can be turned into a battlefield. So by looking at examples like Ukraine or like Gaza, we can see how displacement and humanitarian corridors can become sites where sovereignty, protection, and violence are negotiated, and where international actors may also help to inadvertently stabilize imperial logic through the architectures of various humanitarian aid. And finally, coming back to the case of Ukraine, I think that the case of Ukraine is interesting to consider because it connects also neo-imperialism to global debates on sovereignty and responsibility. it helps us, again, go back to this conversation about security guarantees that fail, right? Michel has mentioned Budapest Memorandum, so I will not dwell on that. It can help us, again, raise the conversation about international legal categories and the origins of those international legal categories. And also, I think these cases like Ukraine, cases like Gaza and Venezuela, they help us to consider the contested boundaries between humanitarianism, militarization, and protection. And I think viewed from this perspective, Ukraine, but also Gaza and Venezuela, they are not just cases, but also they are conceptual fields for us to trace how neo-imperialism is simultaneously a geopolitical strategy, but also infrastructural control, but also it is a very intimate governance of life. And I think I will pause here for a time being.
Thank you so much, Dafna, for that introductory remarks. So as we hear in more perspectives, especially with both Michel and Dafna speaking about both the Ukrainian experience, but also the role of powers like the United States and other global powers that might have interest in these different locations. It will be good to then hear from our colleague Yael, whose region has also been spoken about, where Michel did mention Gaza, but also Dafna mentioned Gaza, and Michel is from Israel. So, sorry, not Michel, Yael. So, Yael, can we hear from your perspective, both lived or research perspective, how issues of imperialism can be contextualized within the Middle East? Is Yael here?
Yeah, Yael seems to be missing all along.
Oh. I'm not sure if is anyone able to reach her so that we can see if she can join us. Tian, please help us while we carry on with the discussion.
Sure, I will send Yael an email now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So let's then move to a different region, the African region, where there has been long-standing war amongst different groups in Ethiopia, both internal groups as well as external players playing a role in the active war in Ethiopia. So can I please call on my colleague Agafari to speak to this contextual experience, but also research knowledge. Agafari, he was here not long ago. Cassie Agafari might be disconnected. So let's then engage with some of the points that have been raised and questions raised so far. I have a few points that I could speak to as well, but before that, Maxi did pose a question to the panel where he said, is the rule or are the rules based on order? Okay, rule-based order not itself a product of an imperial or neo-imperial imperative. So Maxi, maybe do you mind just speaking to that so that we can understand the context of your question? Because we've heard from two speakers.
Thanks, Gabriel. It was a thought that came to me as I was listening to Michel, who's tried to answer my question in the chat. Because it strikes me that we have a so-called rule, or we have had, or maybe still have, I don't know, a so-called rules-based order, global one, which has tended to impose certain rules on the world, which doesn't all of which doesn't necessarily accept them. The resistance by some nation states to facets of those rules, to signing up to International Court of ICJ, International Court of Justice, or the International Criminal Court, indicate that somebody is imposing something, and we have to ask ourselves, where does this imposition come from? I think Dafna began to answer some of those questions in her presentation by looking at the experience of Eastern Europe and showing us how, Dafna, so we rephrase this a bit, I mean, that was one, the experience in Eastern Europe, but how she mentioned how humanitarian efforts, which are also a kind of imperialism, because they're imposing a particular kind of way of dealing with individuals dealing with each other, with states dealing with individuals. I'm not suggesting I'm opposed to them. I'm just asking the question, where does imperialism and an attempt to impose end, and where does concern with others begin? And is that idea of concern with others itself not some kind of imposition and imperial idea? So this is something I'm battling with. I haven't got a clear answer to the question.
Hey, Michel or Dafna, would you like to respond to Max's thoughts?
No, happy to respond, but Dafna, do you want to respond first?
I have a brief remark. If you want to go first, Michel, I don't mind.
Okay. Okay. Well, I guess, in certain ways, if we look at the history, we have World War. To what extent this attempt to put in some kind of logical rules-based order to follow the spasms of the destruction of the great empires after World War I. You had first, I guess, the Ottoman, you had the Austro-Hungarian, you have the Russian, followed by World War II, and then after World War II, the decolonization of much of the world. Various, I guess, African nation states, in a sense, are no longer will be officially under the control of their imperial masters, as well as India and other regions. And with World War II, you have the reconstruction, you have the rebuilding. Much of the money is invested into, I guess, the reconstruction of Europe, of Japan, and other states. So in certain ways, and of course, you have the conflict, the Cold War conflict. So under these situations, we have the attempt to use trade as a way to get out, to finally break once and for all what had been the Great Depression. We have at least the United States trying to be noble in order to position themselves in relation to the Soviet Union. So thus saying we are democratic, we value freedom, we want, I guess, to not be overtly seeking to annex other countries. So, but rather, so it was more done underhanded fashion. So if you look even at Iran, the United States and Great Britain did undermine and sought, I guess, push in the background the overthrow of the first elected president who had done what was seen as the unacceptable, which is nationalize Iranian oil and gas to benefit Iranians and not the the English and American oil interests. So it was the fiction that was kept there to at least to create, I guess, this illusion. But at the very but the difference being that whereas, I guess, after the overthrow of the elected president, you have the installation of the Shah, but it was presented as an internal decision, not so it wasn't saying we will recolonize Iran. Rather, we will ensure to favor somebody who will privilege the outside corporate interests that will also thus privilege, I guess, the United States and Great Britain and other former and, I guess, more colonial power. So I would say we at least we went through the motions of trying to create, I guess, these rules-based orders, but of course I guess the great power sought to subterfuge them in various ways whenever it suited their interests. So is that better than what we seem to be veering into, which will be total chaos, where just, I guess, there will be no rules and it'll be I guess, whoever can win, I guess, can once again conquer neighboring territories will be the one in the sense that imposes the rules.
Hey,
This is
thank
actually a
you.
good place.
Yeah.
Sorry, Gabriel. This is just actually a good place for me to jump in because I wanted to address the part of the question that dealt with humanitarianism, right? And what are the intersections between humanitarianism and imperialism, essentially. And while I will not pretend here that this effort to help, that the humanitarian effort is always pure and devoid of interest, right? Because we all know how developmental aid and humanitarian aid during the Cold War, for instance, was actually a stealthy tool of imperialism, was a continuation of politics by other means, essentially. And how a lot of this humanitarian rhetoric is actually very much steeped in saviorism. However, I also would like to push back here a little bit against sort of throwing it out of the window altogether, so to say, because I think that this concern with others may not need to be an imperial idea by itself, because, it comes down to the question of how do we care about the other, right? And I think that this is the question that can help us disentangle these more imperialism-steeped humanitarian efforts and humanitarian efforts that are just stem from the desire to help, stem from compassion. Because I think it really matters. I think that intentions, cooperation with local actors, but also whose needs are being prioritized and whose needs are being advanced, that sort of questions are very important to consider when we are talking about humanitarianism and whether it is being a continuation of imperial politics by other means. Because since 2022, for instance, in Ukraine, there have been a lot of different actors trying to play this humanitarian hand. And I have seen how some of these organizations, they totally dismissed what people have been asking for, what the local concerns were. But also I have seen, for instance, very good cases of feminist-oriented humanitarian organizations who were taking the needs of local women, who were prioritizing the concerns of the local population. So yes, I would just want to nuance this discussion about humanitarianism a little bit, but thank you so much for raising this point.
Yeah, thank you so much, colleagues. And another point for me that has just been jumping out, which I see Mary has also mentioned, is the issue of collaboration. And where for me, I'm thinking of not just how are we caring for the other, but it's why. And what do we understand as care for the other? And that is where the question of the local collaboration comes into play, where we are thinking of the contextual value of what is considered care. Is what the global community or the external actors given to the communities in which this war is taking place, what that community needs, or is it an imposed idea of what the community should need? And that is where the idea of imperialism jumps between humanitarian efforts to possible imposition of ideas of what is considered good. And we can speak for days about what is good, what is the global good for who? And is there something that's universally good? Is what is good for A also good for B? Or is it possible to have something that is good for country A that might not necessarily be good for country B? But not to get much into these discussions, let's hear from Agafari, who is now back online. I did see that he was offline for a bit. Agafari, do you please mind sharing your experience of how you understand imperialism, neo-imperialism, and how that has played out in Ethiopia in the war that has been on for decades, both internally but also contributed by external factors or players? Agafari?
Okay, thank you for having me. I would like to approach neo-imperialism not primarily as territorial occupation. From my experience, as you mentioned earlier in my bio, I have experience. I conduct research on the pastoral society, so I don't have experience with the foreign nation. So I can share my experience that I found in my research from South Amazon. So this is one of the non-pastoralist group in Ethiopia, so which is located very close to the border of Kenya and Ethiopia. So in the pastoralist, imperialism is actually there. It's not related with outside, but it's related with inside. So in my understanding, the government of Ethiopia actually not negative, but in positive, they bring development agenda to the pastoralist. So that also caused one of main problem. So let me brief it. As maybe you know that Ethiopia has been constructing massive dam across the river Omo. So the river Omo is one of the cross-border rivers in Ethiopia. It flows from Ethiopian highland to Lake Turkana, which is in between Ethiopia and Kenya, which is one of the largest lake, Rift Valley Lake. So in that river, Ethiopia has been building over 3 dams. So this is one of the development initiative. So I think it has nothing to do with imperialism, but after building this dam, the people, the downstream people have been suffered. So this development initiation has both positive and a negative side. The negative side is they overlooked the issue of the pastoralist, and they emphasized on getting hydroelectric power. So in that case, I think the third dam called Gibasiri Dam, it has been completed. It is under operation now. So the operation of that dam caused a mess to the pastoralist society. So I think one of the pastoralists called Dasanech is now, I think, flooded, inundated. Over 66% of the Dasanech community, they are under water. So because of the backflow of Lake Turkana, which is the main cause for the backflow is not much rain, but it is associated with the operation of the dam. So what the point is here, I think this is one of the development initiative, but the government of Ethiopia is really overlooked what's going to happen. So now the downstream, the pastoralists have been paying, and also it is very common there. The pastoral, their economies depend, their life is depend on the pasture. Alongside, they also use flood retreat cultivation because of that dam. They are not using because of that. The flood retreat cultivation is now paused because the flow of the river is not natural. Somebody controls the flow, so because it is controlled by machine, so that the flood that is very important for them is now controlled, managed by human beings, so that also causes a problem. So the pastoralists face a serious challenge is that not only that, but also in that pastoralist area, there are, I think, sugar factories. There are over 5 factories. So sugar factories are good for Ethiopia and also good for the pastoralists, but they come with kind of different lifestyle. So the contact between the pastoralist and the labor worker around the factory also one of the cause for the conflict. So the point is, because of this development initiative, the pastoralists are suffering. Of course, it is not directly related with the imperialism or the powerful nation state controls or dictates the less power, but within the country also the weak, the so-called the pastoralists are suffering from the development initiative. So in the theory it says, I think neo-imperialism is all about indirect control. It's not direct, but what I want to associate here is, I think when Ethiopian government bringing these two development initiative, that is good. So the pastoralists accepted these two initiatives, they accepted them, but after accepting them, I think these two development initiatives bring serious challenge for them. Serious challenge. One challenge is it changed their way of life. Their life is dependent upon flood retreat. Now they hardly practice this kind of life, and also there are conflicts which occur frequently because of with the laborer. So the laborer, they come from the highland parts of Ethiopia. Okay, highland parts of Ethiopia, they came with different way of life. So there is a culture contact that also causes a kind of conflict. So as you mentioned earlier, I studied the indigenous conflict resolution mechanism of the pastoralist. What I noticed is because of these two initiatives, these were one of the causes of conflict there. And how can we see as an anthropologist, how can we see see this issue? That is the question that I want to hear from experienced anthropologists. And finally, I would like to say imperialism. I would like to say a little about the current condition of Ethiopia. So, as you all know, that in 2020 there was a battle. Yeah, there was a conflict. Ethiopia with the Tigray region, which is located in the northern tip of Ethiopia. So the main cause for that battle is issues related with the election and also the power competition. That was the main cause. In this conflict, there are external actors who participated, who aggravated the conflict. So there were the hands of foreign nations, like I mentioned, for instance, Egypt participated indirectly, Eritrea participated indirectly. So and after 3 years of battle, there was a peace agreement in Pretoria. Then after peace agreement, nowadays, there is a tension between the northern part of Ethiopia and the federal government of Ethiopia. So still now, there is the involvement of external actors on the affair of the Ethiopia. So this is also one of the cause. So right now, at this moment, there is a tension that is also caused by the involvement of Amara Fano, one of the regional. Amara is one of the regions, so the regional militia, those who have military, they also aggravated the tension, and it goes beyond that. So the Amara aligned with the TPLF, and they also aligned with Eritrean. Nowadays, there is the tension that occurred between the federal government of Ethiopia and these aligned power. So the involvement of the foreign is also one of aggravating factor. So this is all about what I can say. I'm here to learn from others. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Agafari. So from hearing from you, we can see that there are multiple issues that you are touching on, and this include the local issues around resource and resource management, especially issues of water for cultivation, but also that is directly linked to industrial value, as well as the economy of the country, which will benefit certain individuals or groups of people within the country. And you've also touched on the issue of the war between certain groups within the country, but with as well as the government, and how that is also directly and in some instances indirectly contributed by external factors, whether this be within the African region or beyond the African region. And an important point you mentioned there was how peace deals can be or are often seen as relevant, yet not within the context of the war. For instance, the peace deal entered in Pretoria, yet the war was placed in a different setting. And of course, we see this taking place as well in some of the global conflicts that we've been hearing about, where peace deals are signed outside of the context of the war itself. And that raises another type of question to say, how can peace be achieved if we are not contextualizing our discussion and the efforts to acknowledge peace, where nations are invited to be given peace by certain powers within the globe or within the region, where in Africa, for instance, Ethiopia, Eritrea invited, and Egypt invited to South Africa to be offered peace or to enter into a peace deal. And we see that as well in multiple instances. So what do we think about this idea of being given peace by a certain individual or a certain nation, but also looking at some of the discussions within the chat, we see colleagues, for instance, Michel speaking about how Gaza was Trump touted the idea of clearing out Gaza of Palestinians and building, a whole Trump Gaza state with very beautiful infrastructure, which are, of course, beneficial to certain individuals. So what do we think about this notions where the idea of what we then consider as peace is being offered to individuals? And from the chat as well, I've seen where colleagues such as there was a chat I was looking at, such as Josephine, who mentioned how the idea of humanitarianism comes with a lot of impositions, where you are expected to act out humility and accept the gifts you've been given. We hear of assertions such as Iranians should be excited that now they've been given what they've been wanting all along, and this is the opportunity to take over their country. Or Palestinians should be appreciative, or Ethiopians should be appreciative. What do we think about this whole notion about being given peace, or peace being imposed without understanding and dealing with the contextual issues? And I'm just throwing that question out to anyone in the panel, as well as anyone in the session.
Okay. Thank you again for the chance. I think, from my point of view, I think there needs to be a national dialogue. That is the only way for Ethiopian case. The national dialogue is now started, so it will bring solution. So regarding the humanitarian crisis, of course, the impact of conflict and the impact of any war is it has negative impact. It causes a kind of bad thing to all sections of human society. Therefore, the humanitarian aid is very important, but it is sometimes conditioned. So the one who provide the humanitarian aid gives condition. So that is one way of how the Western, the so-called the Western, the powerful nation states control the third world. So humanitarian aid is very important, but nowadays, just in order to give the aid, they ask they put condition. So after condition, they do that. That this is also one of neo-imperialism. So related with conflicts in Ethiopia, the only solution is the national dialogue. So it will bring solution for Ethiopian case. Of course, it is started, yet not completed. I'm glad to hear you participated the peace agreement in Pretoria. It bring slight peace after Pretoria agreement. I think for nearly 2 years there was peace, but it resumed after the federal government is blamed for fail to fulfill the Pretoria agreement. So, and also the controversy related with the western parts of Tigray region. So these two were the main case for the resume of, again, the present tension. So the solution from my point of view is that dialogue, it heals the problem, it heals the wounds of the impact of the conflict and the impact of the war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agafari. Michel, I do note that your hand is up. You may proceed.
Well, I think at this point we'd be lucky if we even simply go back to neo-imperialism. At this point, we're going towards neo-feudalism, because if we look at the one lesson learned in Ukraine, is that the old wars no longer can be fought using the old technology. It is drones, I guess, the more they're used that are actually effective in stopping tanks and stopping infantry and stopping. And we have the world now is we don't have I guess, the nuclear arms race. We have the AI race. Who will be the first to develop the AI and the robots to get rid of everybody, the working class, the middle class, and everybody else? So that's if we have this dystopia that seems to be emerging, if their dreams come true, we'll have a world where we don't need workers of any kind, whether through, I guess, more the middle class workers working with ideas or the lower class working with, I guess, technology. The wars will be fought not by night, but with drones and high tech, and most of the capital will be owned by a handful of the uber rich who will have their own private armies and their own private, I guess, castles to defend themselves. So what do we do when all of a sudden when the traditionally kept certain powers, I guess, in place, or at least minimize, I guess, their role, i.e., you still needed armies and people to in those armies, you needed workers in the factories, etc. But what will happen to us when all of a sudden when you don't need the factory workers, you don't need the scribes, the monks, or the university professors, when you don't need the factory workers, and you just need, I guess, AI with enough robots to keep your pace or place and privilege, both within states and between states.
Yep, and these are really critical points you're raising, Michel. And just to let our other panel members know, Yale has responded, and she said that she's unable to join because she's in a shelter, and their sirens currently blaring. So she's unable to join for that reason, and she is in Jerusalem at the moment. So some of the points we've raised here, colleagues, how do we then engage with global powers, whether acting within local contexts like Ethiopia, or global powers that are visible acting from outside, where it's going beyond what Michel has said. It's going beyond neo-imperialism. It's going into feudalism. How do we then anticipate a world where there are so-called global policies or global bodies that are meant to regulate relations? And at the same time, those global bodies or policies are not effective. How do we anticipate the world, global relations in such a context or society? And I mean, anyone can respond, whether it be a panel member or any of our participants. Yes, Josephine, I see your hand is up. Josephine, you can unmute yourself and speak. Okay, that might have been a mistake. Is there anyone who wishes to attempt that?
Oh, I'd just like to, I guess, the Shivangi made, I guess, a brilliant point, the idea of the control of the, I guess, the message, which I think is fundamental. And in certain ways, we forget that sometimes technology can bring about radical changes unexpected. For example, it seems, to looking back, it seems somewhat, I guess, we're so used to having speakers, but in certain ways, it was the speaker that allowed for the rise of Nazi propaganda, because all of a sudden the speakers, you could have crowds of tens of thousands, and where everybody could listen, could hear the speeches of Hitler, where you had speakers in public spheres blaring away all the time the message that was put forward by the Reich. You had all of a sudden the incorporation, the new technology of the radio that could bring this message into the homes of each and every German during the Nazi regime. So the question is, are we now playing the same thing when it comes to algorithms, where it's the algorithms that decides what we hear, what we see, and these algorithms can be manipulated to promote certain viewpoints, and generally in the new X after Twitter is very hardcore right-wing views that enable, in a sense, that enable greater power for the elites.
I'd like to briefly chime in to talk about these wonderful points about controlled narratives, because yes, on the one hand, I think there is a very big tendency towards the centralization of media, and I will never really argue against the fact that we are living in the era when there are very few people controlling a few narratives. But like on the other hand, I think that we are also witnessing this fragmentation of even like social media infrastructure, and there are still these spots of resistance towards these big controlled narratives. Those like spots of resistance might not really look like we would want them to look like, if it makes sense, because like there are a lot of like conspiracy theories like proliferating currently, right? And I think that some of these conspiracy theories, yes, they are trying like to push back against this controlled narrative. Again, like resistance might not be coming from the place on the left as some of us would want it to come, but I think many of those conspiracy theories, they are resistance points nevertheless. But kind of like thinking about these like fragmented infrastructure, we can also think like how many people, for instance, they abandoned Twitter and they left for like alternative spaces like Mastodon or Blue Sky or a lot of the other places, because I think that these are also like the social media spaces where some sort of like resistance is flaring up. But also kind of like thinking about these dystopia that is growing on the larger scale. As much as I also worry about these coming of AI, this changing of warfare, and how drones, which are pretty cheap to manufacture, are changing the nature of war, I'm also thinking that, well, I think as human beings, we also require some sort of like predictability, right? It's very difficult for us to live in the world where everything is unpredictable. We require like ontological security. So in that sense, I remain cautious optimist because I think that we are not just wired to live in the world where there are no rules and where everything is unpredictable.
Thank you so much, Dafna. And this discussion really is also touching on a key aspect of our planned discussion or anticipated discussion for today, knowledge production. Whose voice are we hearing? The voices we read on the internet. Whose voice is that? Who is controlling the narrative? Is it a generated narrative by individuals, or is it a narrative of people experiencing the war? Is it a narrative that we wish people to simply buy into as a global narrative, or does it actually speak to the contextual experience? And how can the narrative of people within the context be heard in many instances where access is denied, access to social media? And how can we engage in the information we receive from social media? How do we get to know what is a bot? How do we get to know what is a real person's narrative? Because we constantly are met with different narratives. And that again brings another perspective to say, how is knowledge produced about the different experiences we see? And whose voice is the loudest? And oftentimes, someone will say, keep saying it until the world believes that that is the case. And when we hear of a narrative quite a lot, we begin to believe that, oh, maybe that is the narrative. And the less loud voice or the softer voice gets drowned out because it cannot afford to expand its reach beyond a specific context. And so that is, again, another key aspect to the issue of neo-imperialism. And even when we're speaking of neo-imperialism, feudalism, is it a discussion that people within these war areas, people who have been attacked, people whose families have been killed through different forms of genocide, ethnic cleansing, is this how they see these events, or are these communities viewing these events using different terms? And how do they anticipate the world to respond? And these are things that I would really like to hear more from our panelists, because you've been conducting research in this different context. But before that, can we please hear from Josephine? I see your hand is up, Josephine. Yes, Josephine, we are waiting to hear from you.
Yeah, so about the issue of imperialism, okay, we've been having an issue, especially in our state, around the issue of propaganda. So we've been conditioned since childhood to be watching movies like Star Wars. I know whereby this, I don't know if you've watched the Star Wars movies. Are you
Yes.
getting?
Yes,
Yeah,
we
so
can
there are
hear you.
those,
And please, do you mind just telling us the context you're speaking of? So when you say in our state, which region specifically are you speaking to?
I'm from Kenya.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's been numerous news, okay, rather information from the news media about how my country is involved with the supply of mass weaponry to the states of Sudan. It's also involved in the smuggling of gold to Dubai and the other states. So I'm not a person of war or a person to take sides and everything, but honestly, on my part as a Kenyan, I'm really ashamed because I just want people to believe that most Kenyans are not for the way the government is conducting things. And throughout history, we've seen that we have very close ties with Israel and America. We also had a president who had been in rule, President Moi, for 24 years, who had made a deal with the US to ensure that their interests are protected within our borders, and he would not be held accountable for any sort of atrocities that he might commit towards the citizenry. that he leads. Then there was also that issue of Bill Gates. He's been given state immunity to perform whatever experiments he needs within our borders, which brings up very questionable concerns that are being deliberately ignored by the government. So, okay, I think at this point I can just agree that our country will be sidelined as what's the name? Or rather, I can just say we have leaders who bow down at the slightest request of the Americans. So there's that issue whereby it was exposed that there's a settlement where the Israelis are supposed to come and resettle locally. But previously the settlement had okay, what happened? Yeah, there was a lot of rain last year, so they experienced a landslide. I think there was death of over 100 people, including children. So we've noticed there's that irony of foreigners coming to resettle on top of African graves, not only graves but mass graves. There's also that issue of my country importing animals from the US, but in real sense, the animals are being brought to steal off land from the locals. They come in the name of conservations. They fence off community, sorry, they fence off community projects in the name of conservation, so the community is left out. Then there's this guy who's called Mr. Beast. I think he's using the issue of bringing water to the local communities as a way to steal land and do water projects for the AI. Yeah, they're building AI towers in Kenya, and I understand that they need to be built around water catchment areas. So I hope during this session, I'll be able to understand the connection between the obsession with African water catchment areas and the imperialism and the sudden scramble of water catchment areas. Then you asked about how we can be able to identify and bring about peace in future. I think the main issue should be the language that we use. I feel like violent language has really been normalized, especially in our conversations. We can also see that with the current manosphere. I think they have these fantasies of dominating over their women and children. And then this anger is typically, it is through this anger that they are convinced by the imperialists to go and fight their wars on their behalf. Then they end up dying in those wars. But I think it was normalized through the films we used to watch as children and the books, especially in Kenya, the books that we were pushed to read, especially after colonization. Because for a film like Star Wars, we have there's that group of what are they called? Soldiers called the stormtroopers. They are usually portrayed as working class heroes, but nobody asks why they kill en masse without even a second thought. They have programmed us in a way that we dwell much on who is telling the story other than what they are saying. And they keep us being in this, they keep us in that environment or echo chamber where we have to argue with binary narratives. They're not open to complex narratives, especially of the locals. That's why US can come here and tell us we have the best way to help you conserve your water, conserve your wild animals, conserve your plants. But I don't understand why they frame our local plants as weed, then they introduce the plants that they feel is good for us as locals. I don't really want to dwell on the war part, but I also really want to help you guys understand that it's not only the war is just a smoke screen for whatever is actually happening on the ground. Because here in Kenya, we actually have a war on our food systems, there's also that war on the bodies, especially of African women. And I'm very particular about Bill Gates and the wife. I do not understand how he's so obsessed about policing the what? Is it the fertility or yeah, it's fertility, especially for black women. Because it's always, or is it reproduction? Let me use the reproduction, especially of black women. Then there's also another thing of land. There's massive land being stolen from our people. And when they try to fight back, it is through these imperialist states like our police state that they use to fight back their own people. Because I don't understand how a black policeman can lift a gun and shoot towards a fellow black citizen. I think that's all. My points are all over the place, but I hope I've been able to articulate them well.
Thank you so much, Josephine. And really, colleagues, this is part of why we've gathered in this session to understand issues of imperialism and neo-imperialism from different perspectives. And some of the points I've heard you point out, Josephine, is how, there is the political narrative and political action of state and elected governments, but also there is the narrative of local communities, which is not necessarily aligned with the narrative being put forward by the state government or the actions of the state government. How a community or Kenya as a country and Kenyans as a people then get viewed by other countries or other African communities as causing chaos within the African region. Yet from a local community perspective, that might not necessarily be the case, but might be an action of a few political players who might have benefits from the chaos being created, but also who might have become conduits for global imperial powers, either individuals or state powers. So thank you so much, Josephine, for bringing these experiences from the Kenyan state. And another point that has been raised a number of times is the issue of knowledge production. And Josephine has really touched on this. Whose voices are we hearing? And how can we get to whose voice are we hearing? Which voice matters? And how can we identify which voice to listen to? And this, for me, colleagues, is another key point that I would really like us to touch on. How do we know which voice to listen to as a global community? Any of the panelists can respond to this, or anyone from the audience can also respond or raise any other questions that you might have.
The irony may be now we need ethnographic fieldwork more than ever, if only to know what are the voices to actually speak to people and know they're people and not bots.
Absolutely. And as you're raising this point, I'm just also thinking about how issues of AI have come into our teaching spaces, but that's not what we're getting into, and issues of how do you assess students. But that's a different point. Getting back to the issue of these wars that we've been engaging in, and Michel rightly saying ethnography. Dafna, I note that you've unmuted yourself.
So I wanted to thank Michel for his comment and echo what he has been saying, because there is a lot of worries about what AI can and cannot do, but AI cannot really produce a good ethnography, right? Because AI can write you a line of code, AI can, I don't know, do a very shitty summary of a book, but AI is not embodied. It's not really capable of empathy. And these are the things that you need to do in good ethnography. So yeah, we need good ethnographists. And this is something that thankfully AI will not be able to do for us. But also thinking about AI and thinking about the points that people have raised. I wanted also to somewhat like broaden this discussion of imperialism, because I think we have been somewhat focused on imperialism as a tool of state expansion, as a tool that imperialism as it can be enmeshed in humanitarianism. But I also think that the points that were raised by Josephine also bring us back to the role of big tech companies and in imperialism and neo-imperialism, right? And how big tech companies, they also engage in the extraction of resources, and also like in territorial domination, in pollution. And I think that, yes, this role of technology companies in neo-imperialism, it is also like something that should be on our radar as anthropologists.
Thank you so much, Dafna. Do we have any general question from the rest of the panel members or anyone from the audience?
Gabriel,
Yes.
can I mention something and then I have to go? It's a great discussion. I was writing it, but I was going to say we shouldn't be, as individuals, hopefully we're not going to be grouped with everything that our governments are doing, which is unfortunate, because I've been one of those that's been lumped when we have a certain government and I go abroad and they think I'm like that government, and then I have to work hard to indicate I'm not. And then secondly, I think the ethnographic is very important, sitting with the local people, and even within a humanitarian group, you have different perspectives, but I think that ethnographic is really important, and just sitting with the local people and not imposing one's perspective, but just asking, what do they think? What do they want? And there's nothing in return. That's actually what I think has been very positive, and I think there's some very positive people here. I might be idealistic. I've been told I'm idealistic by a former professor of mine, but I always try to look for the positive in everything. And so great points are coming up here, though. So I just wanted to say that. And
thank you so much, Mary. So Mary is from the United States, and Mary is just raising another point which again Josephine raised earlier, the actions of the state versus the people within the community. And in this discussion, part of what we really want to engage on is to say there are actions of a state, and what is our duty as anthropologists, as people who learn about people. How can we engage in the realities of the communities we live in, and what voice are we hoping to amplify, and what realities are we wishing to stand for, and how do we want to be perceived as individuals, but also as a discipline, where we are fully aware of how anthropology as a discipline has been used in multiple states and places as a tool of suppression. In South Africa, for instance, anthropologists played a very huge role in the suppression of peoples, where people were considered less intelligent and less important because of their skin tone. The higher the quantity of melanin on their skin, the less important they were considered, where anthropologists contributed to the argument that it is important to protect the different races for the value of the larger community. So the key question for me is to say, what is our role as anthropologists within these different states? Being aware of the actions of our government and being aware of the community's experiences and realities. What kind of voice do we wish to speak for and speak with? Yes, Maxi, your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel. I think that's really important. I want to just respond to the point about South African anthropologists. South African anthropology, for those who don't know, many here won't won't necessarily know this, was divided. So there was a cohort, a large and powerful cohort of anthropologists who were indeed, as Gabriel pointed out, complicit in apartheid, but there were others who were trying to work against it. My question, though, was not just around the state. Why are we concerned only with the people versus the state when we see the people creating units within themselves, some of which act like minor states of their own? And then when we're listening to voices, which of those voices do we listen to outside of the state? Because they may, and it was pointed out, sorry, I've forgotten her name, the person she's gone, Josephine, pointed out the gender issue. Should we listen to women's voices rather than men's voices? And I would argue that's one way of breaking up the population, but there are all sorts of others. Because sometimes subcategories within the population, within any population, try to dominate other categories. And we have to be careful of that process. So we have to be asking ourselves about how people form collectivities, how leaders of those collectivities come to dominate them and try to use the collectivities to dominate others within the populations. So we've got to listen to multiple voices, and we've got to have an ethic behind it, which is recognizing, and we go back to the word care, and we've got to, care is in some ways meaningless and says too much. That's probably why it's meaningless. But whose voices, who are the most dominant? Are they dangerous to other people? Who does harm? And how do we listen to the voices of those who are least harmed? I'm going to stop there other than to say, I think we may have something here about ethnography. We may be able to build an argument as this international organization around ethnography as a means of resisting all of what AI is about and selling that as something which anthropology is particularly well placed to do if we do it ethically and well, not remote ethnography, really getting to know people and understanding how domination and harm work hand in hand. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maxi, for raising those key questions. And thank you for just highlighting that point about the fact that, and please, my apologies if I wasn't clear on that. Indeed, not all South African anthropologists were in support of the apartheid state. There were certainly a good number of anthropologists that were against the apartheid state and its actions. So this point around ethnography and how it can serve as a great tool for enhancing diverse voices, and Maxi pointed that, and it's very clear because one of the dangers we can easily fall into is to again fall into the group of a dominant voice. That if there is a dominant voice, that will be the narrative we're going with. But anthropology indeed allows us to open up to diverse perspectives. And hence we can have one person as a research participant, and that is their perspective and that is their voice. And it doesn't matter whether we believe in that voice or not, whether we think that's the right voice or not, but it's a voice. Regardless, it is an experience. And how can we as anthropologists in this contemporary space where there's constant war, allow ourselves to embed or allow ourselves to be embedded within this dangerous context where when we think of danger, we think of human safety, yet at the same time, there are humans within those contexts that are dangerous and unsafe. What role can we play? And I'm asking that question to say, what role can we play from an outsider perspective, but also what role can we play from an insider perspective? We're anthropologists in the different geographical areas, but also how can we contribute from the outside? And another key question I really have is to say, how do we see the role, and I mentioned this earlier on, the role of global policies and global bodies such as the United Nations in promoting what should be global peace. And again, one of the points we've constantly discussed in this session, but also in other forums, is what voice are these global bodies representing? Or what voices are they representing? Which voices are heard within these spaces? And which voices are appreciated in the policies promoted? I'd just like to put that out to anyone in the panel, but also from the audience who might want to give their view on these points.
You don't
I'm so
mind,
tempted to put,
Gabriel.
yeah, and I was just about saying I'm tempted to put two people on the spot, Gonzalo and Virginia, but let's hear from Dafna.
I'll try to be brief. Thinking about your wonderful questions, I actually want to just like float out this idea. I think that was proposed by an anthropologist, Emily Yates-Dorr, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing her last name. I only saw it in written. And she's a scholar of public health, and she has this idea of careful equivocation, right? So when we are working with different social groups, we are also dealing with different positionalities. We are also dealing with different like levels of power. So sometimes it's sort of difficult for us to find consensus. And when we are writing our ethnographies, she sort of insists on this idea of careful equivocation, saying that, well, we have to be very clear about this position of power that we are coming from, but also we have to be very careful about whom we are speaking with and kind of like on behalf of whom we are trying like not to speak. Because like as anthropologists, right, we usually like start from the bottom up and we are being trained in this skill of contextualization. But as we are doing this contextualization, right, it's important for us to ensure that we are not just like glossing over some voices and we are not just like speaking over some of the people, especially like some of the vulnerable communities that a lot of us are doing research with. But also kind of like thinking about like our role of as anthropologists now, I also wanted to, we have talked about the need for ethnography, right? But I also kind of like wanted to remind us that I think it's important to remain humble and to understand the limits of our agency, because sometimes also like as anthropologists, we tend also like to overstate the amount of impact that some of our work does. So like let's err on this side of humility, so to say, because I think it's also very important for us to balance what we actually know, right? This like very limited situated knowledge that we have with some of the greater, maybe like utopian vision that we are trying to advance. But as we are doing that, I think it's also important for us to try to at least imagine some of the unintended consequences that may stem from our work, but also how our work may be used in the other contexts. Because even though, yes, we write things, right, we put them out there and then those things kind of like have a right of their own, but I think that we still should be thinking about this like potential consequences of how our work can be used to like not so good purposes within the other context. I'm sorry that I'm starting to ramble, so I will pause here.
Thank you so much, Dafna. And you're raising key points about being aware of the limitation of our work, but also another point we need to then note is the reality of many anthropologists in many contexts who are afraid of speaking out because of the implication of having a voice. Because having a voice means being directly in danger, either of losing your job or work, and which, again, that's a reality for many people. And and one of a word that just keeps going through my mind at the moment is, do we show empathy, or do we feel a person is wrong if they're unable to speak out? Because they're living within a certain context and they live in a certain reality. Where on the one hand, we're saying, let's have a voice, but let's be aware of the limit of our voice. And on the other hand, there's a context where people are unable to speak because of the realities within that context. But yeah, Jacqueline, I see your hand is up.
Yes, thank you very much. It's quite a very interesting discussion. This is my first time on this forum. I'm Jacqueline Nasuna. I'm Ugandan, but currently working and studying a PhD student at the University of Nairobi. When it comes to this discussion, I feel that all these issues, especially in terms of peace and instability, they are really contextual. And I think as ethnographers, you need to take note of your personal safety and the safety of your interlocutors. And I think there are ways of engaging your interlocutors without necessarily exposing them to harm, because some of these, I would say I'm one of those very big cowards. There are certain situations I wouldn't really want to go into, especially politics is very, very tricky. But at our back of the mind, we really need to take into consideration the safety, both of our safety and that of our interlocutors. Then when it comes to these international bodies, you really see a lot of dynamics, especially I tend to see the dynamics between the global south and global north. Even when we are in discussions, you tend to see a lot of dominance. At first, you tend to see like there's a common good, but behind that common good, there's a lot of structural issues. You still find that there's dominance. And then there are certain groups have been categorized, like they are vulnerable and maybe they are poor. And then you find that actually there's a lack of understanding. When you categorize certain people in a particular manner, like maybe people from the global south, they are vulnerable, they are poor, they are third world countries. It's personally, I find it like it's a form of exclusion, and they come up with all these projects that we are helping the vulnerable, but behind it, you find that there is it's not the intention looks good on the surface, but then at the end of the day, it's like you're keeping that person in a particular position. Like I've seen right now, I'm doing my PhD in a county called Marsabit, and there are 23 counties that are going through drought and starvation. But then you keep asking yourself, why isn't anything changing? Every year you're taking aid, and the situation of the people is not improving. So you are like, it's like food has been used like a tool to either manipulate and exploit people and leave them in a particular situation. Because I ask, like now, then the floods are coming. Then why are we not putting in systems to capture this water such that people do not go into extreme situations of drought, malnutrition, and death of loss of their livelihood? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. You're touching on key points. issues of representation and issues of voices. Whose voice, again, are we hearing? And whose voice are we hearing not only in global politics, but also whose voices are we hearing in discussions and forums like this? But also whose voices are we hearing when research projects are conceptualized or community or humanitarian projects are conceptualized? The reality that, yes, a person conceptualizes a research project or idea from their positionality, that it's who you are that shapes how you conceptualize and think of a project. And I hear the point you're raising about how voices from the global south often get silenced in this conceptualization. And the point you're raising also touches on a different issue of research funding, where the funding comes from, and the fact that research in itself is quite expensive. And the reality is that the funding often comes from the global north, and how we speak about how it's almost impossible to run away from the ideas of the funder. The funder, some people will say, dictates what the research is. And the funder also dictates who they give the money to. And so that's a point that I would really like us to also get really into in one of our hopeful future seminars on issues of research funding and how that shapes representation and voices. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Virginia, I am noting your hand.
You're not in my hand. Okay. Thank you. Oh, yes. Let's see. I think you can hear me. I think everything that has been said here is good, but I wanted to add something. I think it has to do with, I think it was Michel who said we should do ethnography. I'm not sure. But I guess I wanted to simply say what I think everybody probably agrees on, but I have not heard anybody actually say this, and that is that imperial powers like the U.S. Are actually not supported by, I don't know, a small number of people, but often by a large number of people. And we should do research on them. I don't know if the word is with or on, but Mary's not the only one who dislikes this particular regime we're under right now. But actually, there are millions and millions of people in the U.S. who think the U.S. is the best country in the world, who think that, they may have doubts with some things that Trump is doing, but actually they largely support him. So I think if we extend that, I would say we need to do ethnography, not just on the victims of imperial governments, but actually on who supports those actions. This country is full of people who actually think awful things about most of the world and who think that, I don't know, that we in the U.S. should impose our lovely system of government on everybody else in the world. So, that's just my thing. Oh, okay. I will. Oh, Dafna is clapping. Well, we should do research. We should do lots of things.
Thank you so much, Virginia. And your comment really just reminds me of a post I saw about groups of people in northern Nigeria who are demonstrating against the action of the United States in Iran. And there are other groups that are saying that Iranians are thanking the US. So why are other people complaining? So again, it's the issue of allowing space for multiple voices to be heard, where if we don't listen to voices that are possibly in support or against of different actions, we run the risk of running a one-sided narrative, right? And again, it's not about not acknowledging the pain of people. It's also about hearing, like you've said, people who think these actions are okay. Why do they think so? And that really will help us to also understand not just the actions and thinking of one person, but also of a population that are strongly in support of that one person's action. And it would be interesting to see if these beliefs are all the same, because again, a person might be in support of Donald Trump for one aspect of his thinking and not support Donald Trump for another aspect. And you get another person who might support Donald Trump for a different aspect. So in the end, then we might find multiple people who support, but for different reasons. So indeed, it would be good to hear such voices.
And can I follow up a little bit? I just want to say, it's an interesting issue for anthropologists in the U.S. There may be some supporters of Trump, but the vast majority of anthropologists I know in this country are opposed to him like crazy. But do we have any power? I don't know. And they are the ones who largely don't actually do research, ethnography, or of any sort on people they can't sympathize with. So maybe we should change that. Anyway, that's all.
Thank you so much. And just to highlight on 2 points that have been discussed in the chat is the issue of empathy, but also the idea of imperialism, neo-imperialism versus neo-colonialism, where Gonzalo is saying, can we really separate the two? And indeed, I've seen conversations going on where Maxi, for instance, says, issues of imperialism and colonialism can indeed be seen, either the same way, depending on the perspective, but again, they can be seen differently, where colonialism oftentimes will require physical presence in a space, whereas we see with neo-imperialism, people govern from a distance. We've heard statements such as, say, I will govern Venezuela, but you're not in Venezuela. Right. So that is the kind of imperialism that we see taking place in our contemporary times. Thank you so much, colleagues. We're getting to the end of our 2 hours. So I would like us to just hear anyone who wishes to contribute to this discussion before we can then we've already started touching on, so what? What is the way forward? What can we do? And Virginia said, do we have a voice? Can we actually do anything? And that, for me, I would really like us to take the last 10 to 15 minutes of this session to really say, what can we do about all of these issues? What can we do if we're within a state which is seen as dominant? What can we do if we're within a state which is seen as being oppressed or suppressed? What can we do if we're within a state where we can identify lack of adherence to global politics or policies? But also, what can we do when we actually disagree with the global politics or policies? For instance, there are people who fully think it's a great idea that we have a commission of peace, or board of peace, or what is that phrase again? Board of peace, right? There are people who feel this is an excellent idea, but there are people who feel this doesn't make sense. We have the United Nations and other forms of global bodies. What can we do? Do we have a voice? Do we have power? Or are we voiceless and powerless? Michel?
Well, the question is, do we have a voice if we limit ourselves to writing in journals that might be read by 3 people, the editor, hopefully the referee, and the one who wrote it? So how do we get out to the larger public? How do we get the equivalent of the modern Margaret Mead, who can actually have best-selling books that'll make people think and feel empathy and maybe rethink their positions in a way that isn't seen as talking down to them, but simply saying, hey, there's this other reality. So how do we actually connect a voice or voices to this larger dialogue that might actually reach out to farther than fellow colleagues who are reading perhaps occasionally our work?
A very important point, and I'm just thinking of how I had the idea that, ideally I would wish that we can share our webinars, not just on our websites, but invitation to the webinars, if we're able to reach similar organizations. Are there other forums where we can share invitations to our webinars, where we get discussions held not just by anthropologists, but by larger communities? Because these are issues that don't only affect anthropologists, But what we're saying is, as anthropologists who have a specific skill set, what do we do? And thank you for raising that point, Michel. Yes, colleagues, anyone else? Maxi, I see you unmuted. Okay. Josephine, yes, your hand is up.
I think mostly my point will be mostly on media literacy and especially language, because I've realized that most of the tactics that the media is using these days was borrowed from what's the name of this guy? The nephew to Sigmund Freud. I've forgotten the name. Yeah, Edward Bernays. I think when you find time, you can read through them. Yeah, most of the psychological warfare. Okay, the war that we are seeing physically is just a manifestation of the psychological warfare that is going on within ourselves. So yeah, most of the policies that are being used by the UN, sorry to say, the UN and which is the other body, that the peace board that you've mentioned, most of the policies are being borrowed from the psychological theories that were designed by Edward Bernays, who was the nephew to Sigmund Freud, to shape the media narratives that we consume on a daily basis, from the stories, from the articles, and even from the camera angles. I don't know, there's this very funny cartoon, or is it a comic, whereby there are two people, both of them are holding knives, but the camera angle is twitched to focus more on the one who is screaming, but at the same time they have hidden the fact that he's pointing a knife at the person who's fighting back. So yeah, I think we need to look more into that and encourage a sense of community. Visiting libraries, going on those what are they called, sketch tours, to try and learn about our histories or the indigenous knowledge. Reviving the museums, reviving what are they called, the theaters, because now, as we speak now, they have already bought out most of the entertainment sites that limit us to our home, the likes of or the likes of Netflix, HBO, and those alike. So you find that we abandon these places where we usually met as a community, like the cinemas. They are the theaters, right? Yeah, you're limited also to doom scroll on your phone 24 hours a day. You abandon the libraries. There's also that concept of the cities. There's no thought put especially into art of buildings. It's just boxes that are overpowering each other's, what they call skyscrapers or whatever. I think that's also another way we could look into.
Thank you so much, Josephine. Your comments also just made me think about some debates we've had in my department of recent on the value of the libraries and whose voices are represented in the books that we find in the libraries, and how are the books selected to be in the libraries, and do they contain the diversity that we wish to see, but also issues of the museums. What stories are kept in the museums and how are those stories kept? And, oftentimes we're not told about how those stories or artifacts are curated through force and abuse. But yeah, thank you so much for that point. Maxi, I see a point from Michel and Maxi. Michel, do you want to comment?
Oh, cynically say, my child's trying to get the students to read anything. Forget, I guess, I'd be happy if they read any book from the library or elsewhere. We're almost in the post-literate phase of humanity.
And again, it's a question of how are people willing to contribute. And what are we contributing? And whose contribution is seen as valued? And by who? And these are questions that we really cannot run away from as anthropologists. Gonzalo, I see your hand. Let's hear from Gonzalo, and then we'll come back to you, Josephine.
Thank you, Gabriel. It has been a lovely, really great, interesting seminar. 3 points, and I agree with Michel that it's important that anthropology, the question about why anthropology matters is always there today, and so it's important to get a more public anthropology. But again, what Virginia said before, I think it's very important to understand the supporting of imperialism, why people can support something like imperialism. So again, the question is imperialist or neo-imperialism, so to say it in current way of we are seeing now imperialism, it stands for. This is a great question because when we understand the link with imperialism with other social aspects, I think we have to have more a global stand of research. So, because when you say imperialism and you say ethnography, the lack is huge, with this concept. But when you stand for understanding the supporting of imperialism, why people supports not only from USA, because there's more simple questions, for other countries, why many countries didn't condemn some attacks and they stay neutral in this global arena, and normally people also stand neutral. So staying neutral it's also another kind of an ethnographic way to understand or to look for to understand the many issues surrounding neo-imperialism, that in a way that anthropology can also give a prudent knowledge. Thank you, Gabriel.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gonzalo. And again, we're hearing the need to hear different perspectives, and that there's no one side to the story. And oftentimes we get uncomfortable to hear a different perspective, especially where we've labeled a person as a villain, and we don't know why they think the way they think and how well we see what they do, why they do it, oftentimes is hidden. And how can we get their thinking to the fore and be able to engage with such thinking, and especially at a global state or at a wider population level? And this is a question I would really like us to keep thinking about. But ultimately, as humans, how do we wish to contribute to the society we live in, for ourselves and for those around us? How do we wish to leave the society that we currently occupy to generations after us? And what role do we want to play in shaping that generation or that society that is to be tomorrow? If there are no further discussions, those will be my last points and questions for us to continue reflecting on, because this is a discussion that cannot be held within 2 hours and be completed. Yes, Maxi, your hand is up.
Gabriel, I'm not going to add to the discussion now. I just want to say thank you for organizing this webinar the way you have. It's just been a lot easier to have a discussion today than we've had in most of the WAU webinars up till now. We've had a series of talking heads getting a repeated chance to say their say, and we've actually had no real discussion. I've found this a lot more useful, stimulating, intellectually stimulating, and challenging than previously. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maxi. And thank you so much, colleagues, for being willing to be part of this discussion. And for us is to say, what do we want to contribute? And please, let's not forget the fact that we contribute a lot of value, more than we might admit sometimes. And indeed that our voices do matter. Yes, it's important. And as one of our panelists stated earlier, to not overemphasize the value of our voices, but at the same time to not undermine the voices we have. And if we continue to remain silent, the world can also continue to remain silent, but that the voices we have can be stimulating to others who might be silent. And I wish us all the best in continuing to engage as anthropologists and being relevant in our communities, but also within the global space. Thank you so much, colleagues. And I wish you all the best, and a great thanks to our panel members, Agafari, Michel. Who else is here? Our panelists have disappeared already.
Dafna's still here.
Okay, Dafna, thank you so much for being here as well. And yes, we do acknowledge Yale's current limitations to not be part of the discussion. And thank you so much to all other members who are here for just being able to be generous with your perspectives, views, and experiences. And I wish us all the best as we continue to grow as a discipline and being relevant. Thank you so much, everyone.
And thank you, Gabriel, for being such a wonderful chair.
Thank you, Michel.
Thank you,
Bye,
Gabriel.
everyone.
All right, thank you so much.